We've been droning on about the euro crisis for weeks now. The underlying assumption is that it's someone else's problem and we're well off out of it. But the attempts to find a solution raise questions which affect us all. Should we be in or out, more involved or less? We have a studio audience with us. It's nearly 40 years since this country decided it could no longer remain a sceptred isle secure in a fortress built by nature. We joined a common market and now find ourselves part of a European Union. If the Eurozone needs a form of political union to save the currency, what will the politicians tell them? And what does it say about us as a nation? Are we different or just deluded? We'll try and get to the heart of it. Cyprus became the fifth Eurozone state to stick its hand out and ask for financial help today. How lucky Britain is to have decided to stay out of the single currency, you may say. Yet the British position is that we want the euro to survive. Jobs and prosperity here depend upon it. But for that to happen, it's increasingly recognised that there will have to be greater central control of taxes and spending, and that looks to demand greater central political union, from which, of course, we should be excluded. Our relationship with Europe is a huge issue on which the political class of this country seems adrift from the people. In a minute, Paddy Ashdown, Peter Hain, David Davis and Nigel Farage. But first, David Grossman.
Things are changing so fast in Europe right now that, well, even by the time these passengers arrive in Brussels or Paris, there's no great certainty what sort of continent will await them.
There's so many different possible scenarios. Will the euro still exist at all as a currency?
The wonders of foreign travel and the invention of things like the Eurostar mean we've never been better connected to the whole of the European mainland. At the same time, though, the conflagrations going on in the Eurozone right now mean we've never been more politically detached from the whole European project. The question is, where is that project heading next, and does Britain want to be on board?
In a perverse way, I think this is a great opportunity for Britain to actually look at our relationship with Europe. We've been part for a long time now of an institution which is incredibly bureaucratic, which made it very difficult for us to be flexible and to have the ability to do the things which our economy needs. And particularly in the context of the economic crisis, what we need to be focusing on is deregulating our economy. And that's very difficult when Europe's moving in the opposite direction. If we looked at changing our relationship with Europe, it really would give us the flexibility to adjust our economy in the way that we need to.
Of course, it would be great to have all of the benefits of EU membership without having to stump up for any of the costs. But, say observers of matters EU, why would our partners allow us on the train unless we're prepared to pay for a ticket?
Britain has always wanted the same thing. We want a loose free trade arrangement. We don't like the kind of high costs of red tape and excessive regulation. We don't like sending huge amounts of money to French farmers. We've always wanted the same things. We're very consistent. The problem is that's not how it works. Europe is a grand bargain. You get the free trade membership of the single market in return for countries that are not that keen on free trade, like France, getting other things for them too. They want the rules and regulations to guarantee that it isn't a race to the bottom on standards.
Last year, David Cameron suggested that Britain could use the Eurozone crisis to force Brussels to give us back some sovereignty.
Treaty change can only happen if it is agreed by all 27 member states of the European Union, and any treaty change, as the last treaty change did, is an opportunity for Britain to advance our national interest.
However, that strategy wasn't exactly a resounding success. When Britain refused to sign the new fiscal compact, well, the other member states went ahead anyway.
If you try and seize the opportunity of others' misfortune, and when the others are trying to redraft the treaties to sort out the Eurozone crisis, and then we say, aha, you can't have your new treaty unless you give us A, B and C, opting out of the agricultural policy, abolishing social policy or whatever, that wouldn't go down very well. We would be profiting from others' adversity. We'd have no friends or allies in doing that, and people would tell us to go away, to put it politely.
And then, of course, there's the small matter of what sort of Europe the voters want. They seem less and less happy these days to leave the driving to their political masters.
Well, we'll discuss whether we should have a referendum in a little while, but first, here with our studio audience are four people with very different visions of our future relationship with Europe. The leader of the UK Independence Party, Nigel Farage; David Davis, who ran against David Cameron for the leadership of the Tory party and was previously a Minister for Europe; Peter Hain, the former Labour Cabinet Minister and Minister for Europe as well, and the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Lord Paddy Ashdown. Now, David Davis, how important is it that at a time like this we try to redefine our relationship with Europe?
Well, it's going to become very important because the only way out of the problem of the Eurozone will be more federalism, if you like, for some of the European Union members, and more centralisation. We won't want that. That will be something we have never signed up to and won't want to in the future. So we've got to start deciding exactly what we do and don't want.
So this is a pretty big moment.
A very big moment, absolutely.
Paddy Ashdown, you would share that view, I imagine.
Absolutely.
And you will come to the question in referendums shortly and whether people should have a say and what the question might be, but you also believe that, therefore, that this country has to decide whether it is in or out long term?
Not now. No, I mean, I think the deal that's there on the table is the deal. By the way, I was the first politician to say, first leader of a party to say ages ago, 15 years ago, that if there was to be a substantial move of powers to the European Union, that ought to be the subject of a referendum. I think that's entirely right. I mean, look, Jeremy, let me just see if we can identify this. 3.5 million jobs now depend on trade with Europe, our major partners. Probably reduce the trade annually with a European Union, 40% of our trade, 2% with China, down to a family basis at £3,300 for every family in Europe. And I think the important thing is that we make sure that we do the right thing to ensure the European Union survives. I agree with David Davis. That does mean deepening the institutions of Europe. At this stage, Britain cannot go along with that process.
Okay,
but how we say we want to stand aside from the process for the moment, I think, is absolutely crucial.
Well,
whether we do it with amity or with scorn will really affect this country's future.
We'll explore that in a moment or two, but Peter Hain, if Paddy Ashdown's right, and there may be a mechanism for saving the euro, it's something that we want to see succeed, isn't it?
We want to see the euro succeed, of course.
We want to be part of it if it's successful, don't we?
Because 40% of our trade is with the Eurozone countries, and over half our trade is with the European Union as a whole. We've got to remind ourselves why we're in Europe, why I voted yes in 1975, why we went in, because Europe has saved this continent, which we're part of, although an island off it, from war and conflict of a kind which didn't visit any other part of the world on the same scale. There would have been war in Western Europe without the European Union. Are you seriously saying that? I'm saying that the European Union helped cement democracy and peace and prosperity after the Second World War. It's brought countries like Croatia's about to get into a process of joining. Goodness me, when Paddy was a special representative in Bosnia, or shortly before that, Croatia was at war. And now it's actually establishing democratic procedures because of the European Union. Let's not forget that big prize and the prosperity it's brought to everybody. Now, having said that, the Eurozone is in crisis.
Spain, it's a disaster zone economically, isn't it?
But you can't
behind
deny
the whole of the rest of the world.
You can't deny it.
Uncompetitive, with job regulations, environmental standards.
You can't deny it's the richest market in the world.
Well, if you think the Eurozone, with total unemployment at 23% and rising fast, is a success, I'd hate to see what failure is.
I'm not saying it's a success. The euro is a different matter.
You just were. You were saying it's brought us prosperity.
I'm saying the European Union has brought the whole of Europe prosperity. The Eurozone was designed on an entirely faulty basis from the beginning. I voted against the Maastricht Treaty. I always thought the euro wouldn't succeed on this basis. That's a separate issue, but it's a critical issue for us. But the idea that we would get out of Europe and not anymore have access to emergency health care, not anymore make the rules that affect our single market.
This is silly, isn't it? Look, I mean, these arguments we're hearing tonight are 40 years out of date.
Okay, let me
the idea that we have to be part of a political union in order to buy and sell goods with French and German and Italian companies, frankly, is an idea that belongs back in the 1960s.
Right.
We have been through global trade liberalisation through GATT and the World Trade Organization, and you should remember, Paddy, that we are the biggest export market for the European Union in the world. They sell us far more than we sell them. And if you think 3.5 million jobs are dependent on our trade with Europe, there are 6 million jobs in Europe dependent on their trade with us. Mercedes will go on selling their cars.
Hang on a sec, just to bring in the audience a little bit here, because I think it's... Yes, go on.
I do wish the politicians read their history books. Prior to 1914, 40% of the English trade was done with Germany. It didn't stop a war. The idea that you will not go to war with people you do trade with is ridiculous.
No one's suggesting that.
Hang on, I'd just like to, if I may, I'd just like to hear one or two other... who here feels themselves to be a European? Just put your hands up. Why haven't you put your hand up?
I don't feel. I mean, I feel first and foremost that I'm an Englishman, and then Britain second.
A European third, perhaps?
Possibly, but very vaguely. I mean, I think the issue for me is, again, I don't see why we can't trade with these countries, why we have to take part and be part of some growing federal superstate is beyond me.
And you're nodding.
I agree. I totally agree. I believe politically and economically we'll always be tied to other countries, but I just feel the relationship of the Eurozone is just far too close.
Who feels that this is... let's have someone from over here. Who feels this is a key moment in our relationship with Europe? Because something is going on in Europe. At the end, if it doesn't go our way, we're going to be in a bit of difficulty. Yes, sir, you.
Yes, no, it is a key moment for us at the moment. If we go towards more central powers and financial services go into Europe, then we're in a horrible situation. If we leave and just rely on our sort of World Trade Organization, we could be hit with trade tariffs. So we're in a key position now, I think,
sure, but
to negotiate.
Leaving wouldn't settle anything, would it? Leaving the European Union?
If we leave, World Trade Organization would be our only sort of mechanism to trade with Europe.
The European Union has 60 free trade deals with 60 different countries all over the world. Mexico has a free trade deal with the European Union. Are you telling me their biggest export market wouldn't have that deal?
I mean, if you are going to consign us, as you want to, Nigel, to the position of Norway, outside, but nevertheless...
No, Switzerland. No, Switzerland.
Or give Switzerland.
And able to trade with the rest of the world, Paddy. Make our own trade deals. We're forbidden from doing that.
Hang on a second. You made the point. Now let me make a couple of points. One is that if you're Norway or Switzerland, Norway's had to enact 75% of European legislation to remain a trader in the single
Switzerland
market.
Hasn't.
Yes, they have.
No,
Switzerland have had to enact nearly all the financial regulations out of Europe, but run by Europe. That's what you're proposing.
Completely wrong.
I mean, it isn't actually. You can have a look at the figures. Let me give you an argument for the future. I mean, here's the bottom line. I dare say it's not popular. I dare say it isn't agreed by many, but it doesn't mean to say it isn't true. There's almost no domestic issue today that doesn't have an international quotient. Not your jobs, not your mortgage, not your crime, not your environment. Second point. The position of Europe has now fundamentally changed. We have an America looking west across the Pacific rather than east across the Atlantic. We have a Russian president, highly assertive, prepared to use tanks and the Brezhnev doctrine again. You have a rising China, you have a rising India. If Europe doesn't realize the right reaction for the new circumstances in which we find ourselves is to deepen the institution of our defense, our foreign affairs and our economy, we are bloody fools, and the next decade is going to be far...
So get rid of our democracy.
No one has suggested that. Let me just say this to you. If you do not realize that if you really want to consign all the countries of Europe to the perfect sovereignty of corks floating around behind other people's ocean liners, help yourself. But in the world you're about to come into, getting together with our European partners, preserving our democracy and pooling our sovereignty is the way that we give ourselves a powerful voice in a world that is going to be much more turbulent and much more difficult.
Why shouldn't we leave, David Davis?
I think we should renegotiate our position. I don't think we should need to leave completely.
What powers do you think we should take back?
Let me just take one point first. I mean, Paddy has a point that we want to maintain a trading relationship with Europe. I don't accept the price is the one he puts up. And we always get this. It's either or. Either you're in or you're out. Either you pay the club fee or you don't. We should have a relationship which allows us to trade with them, which has cooperation agreements, but not subordination. Whether it's terrorism, whether it's crime, whether it's immigration, whether it's trading relationships. They should all be cooperation arrangements, not, as we are now,
So what should we renegotiate with Europe?
Well, yeah, I'm afraid it's the whole package. I think we have
the whole thing.
The whole package has to be. You have to
Why would they agree to that, David?
Well, effectively
why would they agree to it?
In effect, they've telegraphed something already. Merkel's already telegraphed something already. They see that they are going to go down a route which does not suit us. They know that, and they're going to have to come to a new relationship. What it'll be is a very difficult guess.
If they don't, David, should we leave?
But if we're on our own, we're not going to get a good relationship from. There's no reason why all the other countries are simply going to say, we'll just give you what you want, and you can have exactly the free trade arrangements that you want, but you don't actually have to make any of the rules or be part of all of that.
Okay.
It doesn't seem to me to be practical common sense.
And
you'll still end up paying to the European Union as Norway and Switzerland do.
Exactly.
Right. Are you in favour of renegotiating our arrangement with Europe? Or?
Well, I think it's important that we learn from the lessons of Greece that everyone needs to be properly in the EU or properly out of it. Clearly, when one member state that's in control of its finances goes bankrupt, there's serious ramifications for the other EU members. So we're either all in it together or all out. There's no halfway house in Brussels anymore.
Well, there is a halfway house, and we're in it. We're not part of the Euro, but we're in the European Union. Your point is?
There's no halfway house.
Well, there is.
Nigel said there are 60 halfway houses. There are 60 trade deals.
Let's
there are
separate
all sorts of different permutations.
David, if we separate trade and politics, the halfway house, if you like, is that we can have a trade relationship without being members of political union, and that overwhelmingly is what the British people want.
Okay, I would just bring in this chap over here, you sir in the white shirt.
We are, the people, pretty much in a very sticky dilemma because the main threat to our sovereignty is hardly other nations, it's large financial corporations and multinationals who can dictate to us our fiscal policies, otherwise they will go somewhere else. Now the alternative to that is ganging up with the EU and wider, and that we know is fairly undemocratic, that we know is very much captured by the same sector, but some kind of change is our only hope against something like that.
Let's go across here into the middle of the front row, you in the blue shirt.
I was just going to say that all the conversation so far has been about control, it's been about trade, but you asked the question earlier, who feels like a European? To me, the European Union and European project is more about binding, breaking down barriers, taking away ancient or traditional hostilities and enmities. To me, a large reason to be part of it and to remain part of it and actually to strengthen and deepen the relationship is things like the experience of my son who's just graduated from University of Geneva. I don't think that would have been easy or possibly possible for me in my time when I was at university.
But Geneva's not in the European Union.
I know it's not.
And surely the points are about
it's not part of the European Union.
It's the
Eurozone.
Eurozone.
I'm talking about a situation in which across Europe, including some countries which are not in the European Union, we've seen a tendency for countries to come more together to try and promote more understanding and to try and break down
Isn't the irony of the Eurozone crisis that
be
actually the North and the South are breaking away and being very rude about each other?
Do you feel in your bones this is a democratic institution? Do you feel you have a say over how it behaves?
No, I think...
Does anybody?
No.
And nobody. Does anybody? Is it
absolutely?
This is a specifically selected audience to represent public opinion. Is there anybody here who feels that they have control of the European Union, that their views are represented?
But
you
Jeremy,
do, sir, right at the back.
It's a false dichotomy.
No,
it is a false dichotomy.
I'm asking them what their feeling is. They're entitled to express their feeling.
Hang on a second.
One person on your side at the back there. Let's hear from him. Come on.
We elect politicians to represent us. And we've got politicians in Britain and politicians in Europe who do that.
Well, I mean, were I to show you a picture of Mr. Herman Van Rompuy or Jose Manuel Barroso,
you really are.
No, do you get? I mean, you know who this guy is?
Not at all.
No, that's Van Rompuy. Do you know? So one or two people do know who he is, and Jose Manuel Barroso, you know who he is.
But you can't remove him. You can't remove them.
Do you know who the shadow minister for... Listen...
He's not a shadow minister of anything.
I appreciate that, and I wonder if you put every member of the cabinet up there who managed
He's the president of 500 million people, Paddy. He hasn't been voted for, and we can't remove him.
This is a debate, not a shouting match. Look, it is accepted amongst all of us that the democratic institutions of Europe substantially need reforming. By the way, so do they in Westminster. The fact that the democracies in both of these institutions is not up to the standards we would wish to see is not a reason for abandoning them. Here's a central proposition I'd like to put to Nigel. The American state, the United States, has now agreed to begin trade negotiations with the European Union, our two primary trading partners. Nigel wants us not to be at the table at all.
I
Is that
want
a
us,
sensible
Paddy,
thing to do?
I want us, Paddy, to
I
accept
don't
the
think
offer
so.
that was made to us by the Commonwealth, which is now nearly a third of the population of the globe, who offered us 7 years ago a free trade deal, and the British government rejected it because
Be
we're
serious,
what,
Nigel.
are you saying Australia and Canada aren't serious?
The European Union's on our doorstep. Half our trade is with
We
it.
do
you want
most
us
of our
to
business
turn
on
our backs
telephones,
on it?
Peter. I know you've never worked in the real world, but most of our business is done on telephones.
Right, you, sir.
I mean, I'm with Peter Henn, Lord Ashdown, about the earlier arguments about the peace, prosperity and stability that Europe's brought. Certainly the recent history of Europe in terms of Yugoslavia, for instance, the fragmentation, the nationalisms that were riven, and the hatred and the bloodletting, I think that was indicative of what happens when nations
are forced together against their will.
Well, that's
given
historic
a new flag,
reality.
A new anthem and no referendum.
But the point is, the issue about integration surely is an issue about stability, about the acceptance of respect for human rights, about the acceptance of respect for the rule of law, about a functioning democracy, the Copenhagen criteria. And surely the countries that came from the former Eastern Bloc to escape the Soviet totalitarianism came with a view and a vision of Europe, which I say has been partly corrupted by the way the political class has actually characterised it.
Let's suppose that the members of the Eurozone do manage to save their currency by going to some sort of political and fiscal union, taxing union and a political decision-making union. Would it still be an organisation worth belonging to?
I think it would be, certainly. I mean, I don't have
It wouldn't
Socratic
matter
wisdom.
that we were on the outside of that central core.
I think it's important that we're at the centre,
what would
not
matter,
in the
Jeremy,
periphery.
in that situation, which seems likely, is we are seen as a serious power in Europe, where we negotiate with the Eurozone bloc and we get the best deal for Britain instead of exercising vetoes, as the Prime Minister did in
But
December,
we would have
which
no,
actually are not
you
vetoes
agree,
at
we
all.
would have no say, obviously, in that central core.
Well, we could have influence in it,
If we
although
join
we
the
wouldn't be
euro.
members of it. No, I'm not talking about... I don't think anybody serious in Britain wants to join the euro.
Paddy does.
Oh, I don't know. There are people, serious people.
Paddy does.
He's all for it.
I've never
who would
said at
want
this stage that it would be
all
right
for
to
it?
join the European
Tony
the
Blair
euro.
seemed to
That's
be saying we
absolutely
should think
wrong.
about it as if it's safe.
What I think I do say, and what separates me from Nigel and probably from David as well, is this. If it becomes in Britain's interest to join the euro in the future, I think we should do so. They take the view that even if it was in Britain's interest in the future to join the euro, they wouldn't want to do so.
Well, clearly no one's going to argue let's join the euro if it's not in our interests, are they?
But if you ask Nigel, let me ask this question. Nigel, if in the future it was in Britain's interest to join the euro, would you recommend it?
The Eurozone is headed for a disaster.
No, that's
not
not
just an
answering
economic
the
one,
question.
but a social one.
That's the
Under no
question.
circumstances should we give up control over our own economy and
There's your
our own
answer.
interest rate.
There's
We
your
tried
answer.
it.
Exactly as I said it would be.
It will never be in your interest.
Hang on a
to surrender
second.
control.
Hang on, because it's becoming increasingly widely accepted in Euroland, or rather in that bit of Euroland with a sound economy, that for the currency to work, there will have to be an integration of taxes. That implies an integration of politics and political institutions. The government here has promised a referendum if there's any significant transfer of power from Britain to Europe. Now, before we discover whether this lot are any less disconnected from the general public than much of the rest of the political class in Europe, it's time to hear again from David Grossman.
If you're a British voter under 55, well, you may have noticed you've never been given a direct say in our membership of the EU. And you can judge how far attitudes have shifted since 1975 by looking at how newspapers that are now hostile to the EU then welcomed the yes vote. A yes vote that even Margaret Thatcher campaigned for.
Keep an all-night vigil.
Unlike some countries who see the EU as bringing about a sort of new age of freedom and democracy, Britain's always been far more hard-headed. We were in it not to build a better tomorrow for a continent, but to make a better living for ourselves. Now that living has been thrown into doubt by the Eurozone crisis, well, many in Britain believe that British voters should be given a say on what sort of future Europe has.
I speak as someone who will make a business defence of the single market and EU membership. I think we're worse off out. But I used to work in Brussels for The Economist for 5 years, and I watched them lose the referendums on the Constitution, and so then turn this thing into a new treaty specifically to avoid further referendums, and that was an essentially anti-democratic act. And if someone says to me, you know, Europe basically isn't a very democratic project, I'm afraid I have to agree with you. So I completely understand why there's this real desire to let the people in on this process, because it's felt like a kind of conspiracy of the elites, and what's more, a conspiracy of the elites that at the moment is in desperate shape. And I completely understand that, and I have my own moments of thinking, we should just do this and have a referendum.
But the big question with a referendum is, what would the big referendum question be? What would the public be asked? There are, after all, no specific treaty changes under discussion right now.
Well, this is the political difficulty which David Cameron's facing at the moment, is deciding what that question might be. The public are pretty clear that they do want a referendum, but looking at whether you frame that in terms of renegotiation or whether you frame it in terms of in-out is the question. And I think, in an ideal world, the simplest way of doing it would be quite a radical renegotiation, which takes us back to something which is more akin to simply a free trade relationship. The difficulty you've got there, of course, is getting the rest of Europe to agree to that. And I think at the moment it's looking increasingly unlikely that we would get what we want in that renegotiation.
What terrifies the politicians is, however they try to contain anti-EU sentiment and channel it into a safe sort of referendum, it will end up as a kind of de facto in-out referendum, whatever they try to do. And Britain could end up out of the EU, and none of the main party leaders right now wants to risk that.
Well, let's be clear, there aren't safer options. Almost any referendum you do offer, and I think they probably will end up offering a referendum at the next election, will be an in-out referendum.
Despite many uncertainties over the form the referendum will take, when it'll be, what the negotiated terms will amount to, the campaign's already started.
And that is just as true today. The background campaigning on a referendum that we may or may not get is already going on. The politics, though, is moving in one direction only. All the parties under increasing pressure to commit to that referendum in their next manifestos. None wants to be the last to agree.
Well, our panel and our audience are still here. Just as a matter of interest among the audience here, how many people would like to see a referendum sometime when we can frame the question in the next few weeks or months? Yeah. And you, sir, in the green shirt, have you nothing interesting to say on the referendum?
I have. We already had a referendum, and I voted in it, and there was 2 million for, 1 million against.
I didn't vote. I'm 48. I didn't vote. There were 32 million of us who were too young to have voted.
So you couldn't be bothered?
Well, I was 11. It would have been rather difficult, wouldn't it, really? I mean, come on. And the question was about a common market, not about a European Union.
Yeah, it's a very Which is why Margaret Thatcher made sure that she made it so large that it really wasn't possible to work very efficiently.
There's clearly an overwhelming majority of people here who are, as I say, properly selected to represent public opinion, who do want some sort of say on the subject. Is that the point you're going to make, sir?
The point that I'm going to make is the fact that I too voted for it, but I voted purely and simply for trade. I didn't vote for a political union. I didn't vote for this country to lose its sovereignty. I didn't vote for the amount of money which the European Union is costing us. And quite clearly, I do agree with Nigel Farage's rants that I've watched on YouTube.
Thank you.
Technical expression.
Yes, madam, come on.
I think if the European project is to succeed, it has to take the people with it.
Yeah,
now, the people in Europe, in France and in Germany, are getting more and more anti the EU projects because it's seen what it's costing them. And furthermore, you cannot just wipe away 1,000 years of history in all these countries. They speak different languages, they have different cultures. Yeah. It's not a question of trade and human resources and silly little rules coming over from Brussels. It is a lot more than that involves the entire population.
The lady's right, and it's a fundamental point we didn't cover earlier, and that is you've got 27 different views of what you want out of Europe. That's one of the difficulties we have. And when we talked about democracy, when the Greeks came in, it was after the colonels. When the Spanish came in, it was after Franco. When the Portuguese came in, it was after Catano. You know, we came in with a fully formed democracy. I know Paddy doesn't like it, but it's a fully formed working democracy. Nothing like the European Union. So we have something to lose in this, which others perhaps didn't.
So we have something to gain as well.
Can
and
I
think we should just
let me just explore this a little further. So you're in favour of a referendum?
Absolutely.
Would you be in favour of an in-out referendum?
Well, I think what we've got to do is have the negotiation first. And then, yes, when it comes down to it, in the final analysis, it probably does have to be an in-out referendum once the people have seen what the New Deal is. But you've got to have a New Deal first.
I mean, just before we get to referendums, let's also recognise, I mean, there are some things we will lose, and I agree with that. But there are some things we'll gain as well. Let me warn you that this is going to be a very, very, very turbulent, difficult, bloody 2 or 3 decades ahead of us.
It already is.
And hang on, David, let me just finish. You know, there is almost nothing that I would like the British people to have that we cannot get better by working with our partners. Not in crime, not in mortgages, not jobs, not anything. And the mechanism for doing that, it seems to me, is the European Union. And if we abandon that and commit ourselves to, as I said, the perfect sovereignty of small nations drifting around in a much more turbulent world, our capacity to have the voice to be able to deliver the security I want for the British people will be massively diminished. Just recognise we're living in an age where what needs to be done, almost none of it can be done by national governments alone.
People
and that is the
are
fundamental
entitled
difference.
to express
No,
a view.
I agree with that, Dave. I agree with that, Jeremy. And by the way, I agree with the lady here. I have to say that I think a referendum on Europe is now, in or out referendum, is almost unstoppable. Yeah. And I think, secondly, although I shall be arguing passionately... Sorry?
How far off do you think it might be, this in-out?
I'm with David. I think what we probably have to see is the result of these negotiations. We then have to see whether or not that shifts power to Europe from Britain. If it does, a referendum will naturally have to be called. If it doesn't, we'll have to decide whether or not Britain is advantaged or disadvantaged by that. Whatever you set out the question to be, in the end, what it comes down to is an in or out referendum. And I have to say that I think those who argue the case that I will be arguing, with passion, because I believe it to be right for my country, are going to find it very, very difficult to win a yes vote.
Yes, you, sir, with the red tie.
Surely the question on the ballot paper should be, do you want to be ruled by Berlin? At the moment, we have the wealthiest nation dictating to the other 27.
The question should be, do you want to pool your sovereignty with others to give you better security?
Surrender's a better word than pool, isn't it?
Right, yes.
But it's all this old age thinking, which is 50 years too late. We have to look at the future. Nigel taking over this discussion and changing the rhetoric out there. The British population is being influenced by this minority who's so against Europe because they just don't want to integrate culturally, and probably they don't speak a second language.
Well, what we're arguing is there is no European demos. And, you know, even the introduction tonight sort of said, is Britain being a bit silly and a bit deluded? Actually, this debate is happening not just in Britain, but in every country in Europe. People are saying, we want a Europe, I want a Europe of trade, cooperation, but not one run by Herman Van Rompuy, not one that costs us a fortune, not one that makes most of our laws, and not one whose courts overrule ours. So the Europe of cooperation.
Jeremy,
okay. I mean, all right, Peter Hay, on the referendum specifically, if you don't mind.
Well, I think a referendum is almost inevitable. If people want a referendum, politicians should not deny them a referendum. But this is going to be a big, big decision. It shouldn't be now, because Europe is in crisis. If you suddenly put Britain,
you don't know what you're voting on right
exactly,
now.
But if you suddenly put a British in the middle of all of this, you could imagine the chaos and the run on virtually every currency that would result, including ours.
Do you think the Labour Party should commit to a referendum in-out?
I think we've got to see where we get to as a result of this current crisis. But I would say this, I'm not frightened of a referendum. I don't think the Labour Party should be frightened of one either. If people want a referendum, then people will get a referendum. We were the party who gave people a vote in 1975 on a referendum, the Tories having taken us in without one, and we will give people a vote if that's what people want.
So when do you suggest exactly that this referendum would be run?
Well,
Lord Ashdown said that we've got maybe 2-3 decades of turmoil.
No, I didn't say that. That was.
Are you suggesting that we wait until everything is nice, calm waters, and then decide?
I made it very clear.
Let's find out whether we want to be in or out.
No, sir, you misrepresent me with great respect. I made it very clear that I agree with David Davis. When the negotiations are finished, we see what the balance of powers are. If this country is going to be disadvantaged by that, or if there's more power to be shifted to Brussels, a referendum becomes.
Is it possible?
Don't you misrepresent
on
me.
a point of clarification,
Very important point.
Is it possible that Britain could be significantly disadvantaged? A shift of power, which was not actually a passing of a power from our Parliament to an European institution, but was simply disadvantaged by the existence, the creation of some political union that involves the other members of the Euro. That's possible.
It's possible.
So that itself could trigger a referendum in Europe.
If this country believes that because of the new arrangements for Europe, we believe that there's a danger that we'll be disadvantaged, that may well be the circumstances in which a referendum is.
Frankly, that shouldn't be a ministerial judgment. At the moment we have a ministerial judgment, have we handed over
that judgment but the government? And they have to be responsible.
If this country decides...
Who's going to decide? Some newspaper? Or who's going to decide if not the government? The government is made to decide. Of course I will.
Yeah, right. Okay. So you don't misrepresent me in the first instance. There should be a referendum either way. Whatever the outcome of the negotiation, there should be a referendum, because we are already in a transformed circumstance. We're already, I mean, Paddy may not have said it, but he was right.
Do you trust David Cameron and Nick Clegg to make that judgment?
I think any politician in power is going to have to make the call in favour of a referendum, or lose massive numbers
That wasn't quite my question.
They make the call.
Do you trust them to make
an
adequate call?
I think they will.
I think the great danger
isn't
the great danger that actually what we get is not an in-out referendum. The danger is that the political class will try and play the trick on us they played in '75. They'll say, we've renegotiated, you can have a trade deal with Europe whilst the rest move forward to political union, and they'll ask us to vote yes to staying part of a single market that regulates our industry. And that's my big fear with this, and we've got to push all of us that want a referendum. Let's have a proper in-out referendum.
I hope that we'll have a government that negotiates seriously with the Eurozone countries and gets the best deal for Britain. We'll stay outside the Eurozone, but gets the best deal for us. What I fear is that we actually will have a government, this one, which turns its back on the negotiations and says we're just walking away. Then they go away and do a deal like they're doing, for example, on financial transactions tax, which actually may be prejudicial to Britain's interests, and in this case our finance. So we've got to be right at the centre.